And I wanted to bring up real quick, too, another video of yours that I enjoyed. And the latest video is titled "The GSM Leads to the Ice Age." I've always been told that GSMs don't lead to ice ages, but I find your video interesting and your work interesting, so I'm curious to hear why you came up with that conclusion.
The conclusion is based on the measurements that we get from carbon-14, from carbon-14 measurements in historic samples. And if you look at the carbon-14 measurements, there's three big solar minimums spaced around 300 years apart. The last one was the Maunder minimum. The Maunder minimum was the lowest, the deepest cooling. The one previous to it, I think it's the Spiro minimum, that was not quite as cold. And the one before that, it wasn't quite as cold than the previous one. So these solar minimums were getting worse.
Yeah.
And the last one, the Maunder minimum, was so low we had no sunspots. They didn't measure the sunspots before that. We didn't know that. But the Maunder minimum had no sunspots at all. If you look at the underlying decline of the minimal portion of these three solar minimum periods, there's a sort of a declining slope. And that declining slope keeps continuing. It doesn't stop with the Maunder minimum. Now we're looking for the next one in the 20, somewhere in the mid-1920s. And this one will be lower than the Maunder minimum, because that underlying support is no longer there. If the Maunder minimum was already so low that it could have brought us into a little ice age even then, because it brought us to the point where the sun was so weak that it was almost not operating anymore. If we had dropped a lot, if that recovery pulse hadn't come, we would be in ice age already. So I'm saying to myself, now that the recovery pulse is over and the next minimum is coming along, we won't have the underlying support anymore to recover the sun back. We have a reversal of it into a new warming period. We just don't have that support anymore. And that's why I'm saying, watch for the next big grand solar minimum. It won't stop. It will just keep going until we get into the next ice age, because there's nothing that can reverse it.
Yeah, the Maunder minimum, like from my research, the sun triggered into a minimum, and then volcanoes went off, which also added to the cooling and how deep the Maunder minimum went into that specific ice age. Is that correct?
Well, the volcano going off were most likely the effect of the Maunder minimum. During the Maunder minimum, you have a very large volume of cosmic ray flux coming from the sun, and those effects do cause earthquakes. That's been well demonstrated. But the recovery that we have from the Maunder minimum up was definitely caused by a different recovery pulse than the recovery from the solar minimum before then. If you look at the carbon-14 chart, the recovery from the solar minimum prior to the Maunder minimum was a part of the 250-year cycles. The 250-year cycles will continue, but Also, the downslide of the background behind it will also continue. So there is not enough left in the 250 year cycles to bring us back. And right now, the 250 year cycles are on a downslide. So they're going down, the solar wind is going down, the sun is getting weaker. Everything is going down, and there is nothing there that when we get the kind of solar minimum that will bring us back out again, that the underlying support isn't there anymore.
Yeah, I mean, when you compile all this data and put it together and it all corresponds and points to the same cooling trend, it really makes you think. And that leads me to my next question is, with all the mounting scientific factors indicating the sharp cooling trend into 2050 and beyond, with carbon-14, beryllium-10, the sunspot history, etc., when do you think society is going to actually wake up and start shifting and learning to adapt? To me, that's the scary part going into this is, you know, when is there going to be a time where people can put the political agendas behind us and look at the scientific data and really start coaching society into a new mindset, into adapting to this?
Molly, the scientific community is the one that has to drive the ball. Right now, the scientific community has been hijacked, as it were, into the global warming camp. There is nobody that can, in the scientific community, write a paper on the coming ice age. It doesn't exist. It will not be published. The scientific community is totally controlled. But the political system is changing. The political system is changing so fast that we will see the scientific community becoming free to focus on what's actually happening. And once this freedom is established, you will see all kinds of things coming to the surface that will support what we already know. We're kind of underground, as you want to say, to give you an indication of how badly the control is of the scientific community by the global warming camp is, when they had that global warming thing started up. You remember there was a Kyoto conference over, where we have to all of a sudden conserve carbon fuels and all that stuff. The scientific community, they came up and said, hey, we got to speak up here. We're going to, and so the University of Leipzig, my home country, they organized a petition. No, I think it started at University Heidelberg. They organized a petition of the scientific community and say, are you really agreeing with that? Are you in opposition with that? And they had about 4,000 mail-in responses from all over the world saying in opposition to that global warming thing, but that was never even heard. And then the University of Leipzig started another petition, and they addressed only the climate specialists, of which this is a very small group, and they got 110 responses of the real scientific experts on climate in opposition to the global warming thing. And that was supported to the Kyoto conference. It wasn't even heard. And then the university, I think somewhere in Oregon, they started the Oregon petition project, and it went out to scientists all over the world, and they had 20 or 30,000 what you call it, responses, mail-in responses in opposition. So the scientific community took that massive opposition, it's almost a protest statement, and took it to the different countries that signed up for the Kyoto Accord. And guess what? They got only a 20% ratification. So the countries did hear what the scientific community was saying. And that is still ongoing. There is the Oregon Petition Project is now online, and I think they have 37,000 statement of opposition on it. So the scientific community is not in agreement with the global warming thing, but the political pressure is still there to maintain that global warming thing. But the elite is losing power with China developing more economically and scientifically. They can no longer hold the thing back together. I would say in about 2 years, the global warming opposition will break down, and the scientific community will be free to speak about what's actually happening.
Well, and I hope that changes, because I know there's certain people in politics nowadays that want the truth, and there's slow leaks coming out about NOAA fudging numbers and claiming that the Earth has, experienced the third warmest year was in 2017. So I think the proof will be in the pudding, especially people who are in the Grand Solar Minimum community and the Ice Age community that know the science. And like I said earlier in this interview, all you have to do is look at the historical data and look at what's going on right now, and they're lining up. And if anything, I agree with this statement. We're a year and a half ahead of schedule. Some scientists are saying that this is accelerating faster than they imagined.
You mean the weakening of the sun is accelerating? Yeah.
Yes, the entrance of the solar minimum right now, the effects that they were predicting are happening a year and a half earlier than they had thought. So I can only imagine what we're facing here in the next 20, 30 years. And then afterwards, that's the real challenge, which, Mari and I preached about how right now it's important for society to work out a solution, because it's our kids and our grandkids that are going to be the ones that are going to be in trouble if we don't think now and do things to take preparations for this upcoming Grand Solar Minimum and Ice Age. Conclusion.
The conclusion is based on the measurements that we get from carbon-14, from carbon-14 measurements in historic samples. And if you look at the carbon-14 measurements, there's 3 big solar minimums spaced around 300 years apart.
Get worse.
We're getting worse.
Yeah.
The last one, the Maunder minimum, was so low we had no sunspots. They didn't measure the sunspots before that. We didn't know that. But the Maunder minimum had no sunspots at all.
And I wanted to bring up real quick, too, another video of yours that I enjoyed. And the latest video is titled, "The GSM Leads to the Ice Age." I've always been told that GSMs don't lead to ice ages, but I find your video interesting and your work interesting, so I'm curious to hear why you came up with that conclusion.
If you look at the underlying decline of the minimal portion of these 3 solar minimum periods, there's a sort of a declining slope. And that declining slope keeps continuing. It doesn't stop. The last one was the Maunder minimum. The Maunder minimum was the lowest the deepest cooling. The one previous to it, I think it's the Spiro minimum, that was not quite as cold. And the one before that, it wasn't quite as cold than the previous one. So these solar minimums